Hello, and thank you guys for joining us again. I'm Adam Saprasky. I'm the broker for Cardinal Realty Group. I'm also a licensed real estate attorney in the state of Florida. I specialize in real estate law and real estate transactions. Today we are going to be going over the lead-based paint disclosure form, all right, for the contract for sale and purchase of a property. Okay, sometimes, in fact, whenever a property that was built in 1978 or earlier is sold, by law, it is required to include one of these forms. Now, this is the seller. A lot of the times, a buyer will put together a contract package and present it to the seller for seller's acceptance. So sometimes the buyer or the buyer's agent will include this lead-based paint disclosure form along with that package. And sometimes they will even try to pre-fill it out for the seller. So this is something that you might want to get the seller on the phone for if you're going to attempt that, because this is a disclosure that the seller needs to make. The whole point of this form is the seller saying, I am aware of lead-based paint in this property, or I am not aware of lead-based paint in this property. Okay, they are just disclosing to you those facts, which, by the way, lead-based paint could be very harmful and deadly. So you do not want to buy a property with lead-based paint. So if I was the seller and I was disclosing on this form whether or not there's lead-based paint, I would go ahead and fill out this part right here. Seller's disclosure, okay? Presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, check one or two below. So the seller's going to have to check one or two. Either known lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards are present in the housing, or two, seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Either the seller knows or the seller doesn't know, right? So hopefully the seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint, because hopefully there won't be any, okay? So we're gonna do a hypothetical lead-based paint disclosure here, okay? And I am acting as the seller, hypothetically speaking, okay? And I'm checking off this box, seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint. I am selling my house. It was built before 1978, and I am filling out this disclosure form to the buyer and letting them know that I have no knowledge of lead-based paint in this property. Okay? And now, do we have any records? B, records and reports available to seller. Check one or two below. 1. Seller has provided the purchaser with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint. Or 2. Seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Okay? 1 or 2. Either you have some reports, since we checked off that we have no knowledge of lead-based paint, either we have some reports that says, hey, there's no lead-based paint, or we don't have any reports. So we're just hypothetically check off seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Okay, and then the seller has now made their disclosure. Either they knew or they didn't know. Okay, and now the purchaser needs to acknowledge that the seller disclosed this information. So the purchaser is going to initial these lines. Line C, purchaser has received copies of all information listed above. Okay, if there was no information listed above, still can initial there because they've received all copies, none. Next line, D, purchaser has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. So now that the seller has just made the disclosure to the buyer, whether or not they have knowledge of any lead-based paint on their property, the buyer now needs to acknowledge that these disclosures were made. Okay, so they will initial on line C okay, if they have received copies of all listed information above, which they should and will. They will initial line D if they receive this pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. And they will check either 1 or 2, box 1 or box 2 below. Did they receive a 10-day opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint? Or did they waive the opportunity to conduct such a risk assessment? Okay, so hopefully they didn't waive that opportunity, because it's important and you want to make that inspection. And down here, if there is an agent of the seller, the agent of the seller will need to initial here as well. Okay, and then everybody needs to sign: the seller, the purchaser, and both of their respectful agents. And that about wraps it up for today's lesson on the lead-based paint disclosure form. I hope you subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's full of very useful information for a lot of real estate professionals and anyone in the real estate industry. And shout out to all my Cardinal Realty Group agents out there. I know you're working hard and I appreciate it. Thank you.